is on introductory, lower division, and general education courses. Again, before we get started, I just want to remind everyone that we'll be recording this panel. We're recording this webinar. We'll plan to post the recordings. We retain the right to rebroadcast and distribute it online. By participating, you're agreeing that your contributions become part of the recording. This includes any video, audio, chat, question and answer sessions. So just to be aware of that. Also in the chat window, make sure that you have your chat set to be all panelists and attendees instead of just all panelists. We're going to be making use of the Q&A tool as well if you'd like to ask our panelists questions. So right now we're planning on having 3 panelists. So we've got Joshua Bowman from Pepperdine University, Amanda Mangum from Converse College, and Sasha Townsend from Tulsa Community College. Each panelist will have a few minutes to introduce themselves, to talk about their experiences and their background with lower level coursework, and then we'll open up the panel for questions. At this time, Sasha has not yet logged in, so we may only have 2 panelists today. We'll give her a few more minutes in case she comes. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joshua Bowman. Josh?
Hi, good. It is officially afternoon here too, so I can say good afternoon to everyone. So my name is Joshua Bowman. I teach math at Pepperdine University in the Natural Science Division. So just to give you a sense of the context of what that's like, it's a private school, liberal arts institution. There are 5 colleges, but only 1 undergraduate college, and that's primarily what's in Malibu with about 3,600 students. Our math program, we have about 8 full-time faculty and around 10 to 12 graduates per year. I've seen smaller and larger than that, but we do have a regular graduating class, but most of our work is in service courses, largely for the sciences and for business. So that's kind of the context I'm coming from. Before coming to Pepperdine, I just finished my 5th year at Pepperdine. I was visiting at Smith College, and I just mentioned that because that is where I was when I actually started using some of these alternative grading systems. Go to the next slide. So just to give you an idea of what sort of experience I've had, and just some comment on the title of this slide, there was some discussion yesterday about the use of the term mastery and mastery grading. So I've gone back to an older term I used to use, which is alternative assessment, which is maybe not a great term either, but I think giving alternatives both in what we do and what we say is useful. So I'm going to say a little bit more about what I mean by these in just a moment, standards-based grading and specs grading, but largely I've used standards-based grading in my calculus courses, calculus 1, 2, and 3, lots and lots of calculus 1, almost every semester I've taught that, as well as in a probability course I taught a few years ago. And then specifications grading in a proofs course, as well as upper level courses. These are all sort of proofs-based topics. So that's the spectrum I've used these methods in, and so I'm going to be focusing more on the earlier classes. There's some conversation in the chat about what lower division means. So for me, that's basically anything that might be a 100 or 200 level class. So anything that, largely things that are taught to other majors besides math. Next slide. So today we've been getting more into the nuts and bolts of what it means to use alternative assessment or mastery grading. And of course, there's a lot of things that can mean. We haven't tried to pin down too much exactly any system that anybody needs to absolutely adopt. But two terms that have been used a bunch today and that I think you'll continue to hear are standards and specifications, and they can be a bit jargony. So I'm just going to kind of give a coarse definition of what I mean by each of those. So standards-based grading for me is providing the students with a detailed list of skills or maybe collected skills that I want to see them become proficient in. And when I started alternative assessment methods, that's really what I latched onto. As I said, I don't want to give you points and then tell you what it was you need to do to get more points. I want to tell you what it is you need to do and what you've done. So that's what I mean by when I say standards. And then specifications, broadly speaking, is a set of criteria that you need to meet in order to reach a certain letter grade at the end of the semester. It's one way of thinking about it. Of course, we don't always phrase things in terms of what letter grade we want, but it's a criteria that you have to actually achieve and be seen. So largely speaking, and this I think lines up with some things that were said at the first webinar this morning, I tend to use standards-based grading for lower level courses, so for these lower division courses, and specs for upper level. And the reason for that, for me, is largely that in the lower level courses, there are specific skills that I need students to demonstrate and to acquire. And that's partly because of the service nature of the classes. These are things that you need to be able to apply in later classes. Whereas for upper level courses, largely we're talking about developing the students as professionals, whether in our subject or just, as they're gonna go out and the broader sets of skills that they might need. And so how do they demonstrate that they're developing those? Now, that said, I am happy to have any pushback on this distinction. I don't think that these are exclusive. I think they can be mixed and matched in many ways. There was a little conversation in the chat this morning about standards for mathematical practice. Those really apply at all levels. Are they standards in the sense that I've already said them, or are they more specifications or habits or something like that? So I think there's a lot of mix and match that goes on with this. I have one more slide. So I'm actually going to push back myself a little bit on the distinction. A helpful observation, which has been cited, I think, a couple of times today, is that for me, I see standards as really emphasizing the content of the class. What is it that we want students to know or to be able to do? And so that's the list that I provide them. Here's what you need to be able to do when you leave this class. Whereas specification emphasizes the activity of the course. What is it that we actually observe the students doing? Now, the reason the distinction can be a little muddied here is that the only way we can know what students can do is by seeing what they do actually do. So that observation really is a proxy for what they're doing, for what's going on internally. But again, to say why I prefer standards for introductory classes is I do think that they giving those detailed expectations aid them in their learning. Part of what they're learning is just the vocabulary of what's going on, say in calculus or something like this. And I'll just add one final rule of thumb. Some people have said maybe one standard per textbook section. I think of it as one standard per an hour or two of class time. And that actually works both ways. You can then take what it is you want them to learn and convert that into standards, but then also once you've said, hey, here's what I want them to be able to do, that can help you reshape your calendar as well. So it's a good feedback. So I'll stop there.
Great. Thanks, Joshua. Our next panelist is Amanda Mangum. She's from Converse College here in South Carolina with me. Amanda?
Hi, so I am Mandy. So I am at Converse College. It's a small liberal college, liberal arts college. It was all women. We are this fall accepting men for the first time in the undergraduate program. So it's a bit different, and it is very small, less than 1,000 undergraduates. So that means that there are 3 of us in the math department. Before this year, though, I was at Niagara University in upstate New York. So it's also a smaller liberal arts school. It is co-ed. It is a Vincentian school. So a lot of the work I had done in the mastery-based testing was done at Niagara University. And then last year, I also carried that over at Converse. All right, so when I was sort of thinking about this, I know we've covered a lot of this already today, but sort of thinking about, for some of these lower level classes too, thinking about what I felt like mastery looked like in each class, right? And it's very different based on which class you're teaching. And then I thought another big part for me for planning for these also had to do with the retakes. So when I first started this, I was giving one retake, well, you could retake any concept previously not mastered per week. So I preferred that you did it on one day, but that there was basically a day that I had long office hours. And I've heard even other people today talking about how they've used their tutoring center, and certain tutoring centers are able to proctor for you, or whether you need office hours. I was holding my office hours in a classroom so that I had enough space. I would turn desks facing the back wall so that they could, people could be doing retakes. Desks facing the front wall, those people could be asking for help for normal office hours for any of my classes. But that way there was some separation, more than I could just do in my office. But then again, I had to reserve a room for my office hours, a classroom, that kind of thing. So, I mean, even just planning how you think that'll work. Or there's been a lot of talk about these oral exams, or sending in even recorded videos now, especially for people being online, or setting up one-on-one Zoom meetings, things like that. Same thing with the final exam, how that works. At my former institution, we were required to have a common final that I did not write. So, right, it had to be graded partial credit. That was separate, thinking about how that went into my course, that kind of thing. And so, and this has also come up in some of the earlier sessions today, thinking too about how to leave space at the end of the semester for retakes as well when you're planning. So in my course, the way I did it, or especially Calc 1 was jam-packed with content, I basically cut off the content for the standards that were counted for grading, for the mastery-based grading portion. There were 16 of those. Even though I listed more standards, those were not actually counted because we weren't going to have time to retest those between when they were taught in class. They wouldn't have enough retake opportunities, I didn't feel, before the end. So going with that too, right, I have done this in Calc 1, Calc 2, finite math. So for us, finite math is basically at Converse the math that nobody else, for people who don't want to go on in math, we have a really strong arts program, music program, things like that. So those are a lot of the students who take our finite math course. And then I also did specs grading. We have a bridge course to getting people into pre-calc. And so I did specs grading for the bridge course as well. Okay, and then also with the planning, one thing that I found really important was even talking to your colleagues. So especially for Calc 1, right, there are a lot of people from a lot of different majors who are in there. So I found that helpful as I was trying to get buy-in. It wasn't just student buy-in, it's also faculty buy-in. When I first started doing mastery-based testing, there was some pushback from students in the chemistry department who said, you know, math isn't my major, why am I spending so much time learning math and in your course? So I thought that was one of those interesting things to also just have discussions with, you know, the chemistry faculty and get buy-in from them, which was great too. You know, they bought in, and then working with them, explaining it to them, and then as they're talking to their students, their advisees, they can explain that as well, especially during advising season, things like that, setting the expectations for what Calc 1 would look like. So I thought that was helpful. Yeah, I can do next slide. And then same thing, right? We've talked a lot about buy-in, and one thing that I find was important for me, especially in the lower level courses, was encouraging them. So especially after that first test comes back, I think a lot of students would look at their scores and think, well, you know, I can't do perfection. And we have a lot of discussions about, well, it's not about perfection, right? It's about learning, it's about the process, right? And it's hard to learn. And you know, for anybody, if you're learning something well, there's a lot of practice that goes into it, but you're completely capable, and we'll kind of talk through the process of that. And so also with that, there's just sort of a frequent reminder too of sort of how the process works, getting them comfortable. So in my courses, I also give out the first concept. I usually have tried to make the first standard some review material. And that way I give it the very first week so that there's something that's graded that goes back to them. And then we can actually have a discussion about, you know, what the different grading marks mean, when the next opportunity to revise is, when the next opportunity to retake it is, what that looks like. We can talk specifically about that problem, what different solutions would get what different scores, things like that. And same thing, the learning management system, I've used both Canvas and Moodle. And I've switched up different ways that I've done this, right? Just trying to make it really transparent for students. This last semester, I basically split it into 3 tests for them so they could kind of just see chunks of material, right? We have these in-class testing periods, and the score in Moodle would just say like 4 out of 5 concepts, right? So they'd have like a 4 out of 5, and then in the comments, I would just write in the comments, here are the concepts you still need to master, right? So that we could all keep track of it pretty easily. They can always email me, they know that too. And then same thing, right? Getting them to come in office hours. I like to do a lot of the retakes in office hours, or, you know, in some sort of, where you can have some sort of one-on-one discussion to ask them questions. You know, sometimes they're shy to ask questions, so you can ask a question to get it started too. Just get the discussion started before they do their retakes, and just ask how class is going, or if they have questions about the whole structure of it, things like that. And I think that was basically my intro.
Great, thanks Mandy, thanks Joshua. Since Sasha couldn't make it today, I'm going to go back to our title slide that has our speakers' names and photos on it. Oh, there we go. So Sasha isn't here today, but I'll be happy to field some questions. From the Q&A, the first question that we have for our panelists is, I've worried about the issue of no time to reassess near the end of the semester. So students be tested on those end of semester non-mastery concepts on the final exam. Josh,
yeah, for me, they showed up on the final exam, but the final exam was graded partial credit. So we did have that common final that we were required to do. I kind of carried that over. It's helpful, I think, for students to still be studying for that. So there was a final exam, it counted on the final exam, it was partial credit, but it was not part of the standards grading testing score for them because the material, and I explained to them, like, there's just not enough time. They would have maybe one retake opportunity and that was it. And I felt like that wasn't necessarily enough.
Joshua, do you have any insights about the end of the semester?
Yeah, so what I've done is I've just constantly increased the number of tests that I'm giving so that I make sure I have a test in the last week, or if, you know, if that's not allowed at your school, sometimes the next to the last week of classes, so that it can be those, you know, like final, you know, collecting ideas, standards can be assessed at least and show up on the final.
Hi guys, I'm sorry I'm late.
No, we're very glad to see you, Sasha. Would you like to take a few minutes to introduce yourself and talk about your experiences in lower division, intro, general education level courses, and then we'll go back to the Q&A session.
Okay, sure. I'm so sorry. I thought it was Central Time, and then I looked at the calendar and I was like, oh, okay, I'm an hour late. Okay, or not an hour, you know what I mean. My name is Sasha Townsend. I teach at Tulsa Community College, and I think about 70% of our incoming students have to take developmental math. But I teach standards, or I teach Calculus 1, Calculus 2, Calculus 3, and differential equations with standards-based grading. So basically what I have are a bunch of engineering students, all students that want to be, that are future engineers. And many of them have had to take developmental math in the first place. They'll stay at TCC for 2, 3, sometimes 4 years, just getting caught up on their prerequisites. So I've got to, I mean, I'm sure it's true throughout the country. The problem with calculus is that people don't know algebra, and they know how to start the problem, but they can't ever really finish it because of their algebra skills. But that's particularly valid in Tulsa. So yeah, that's what I do. I've been using SVG since 2016. I read about it on some Facebook post. Somebody shared a blog about standards-based grading. I was like, oh, maybe this is the solution. This is the solution to the problems with all the deficiencies that I was seeing. So.
That's great, Sasha. Welcome. One of the questions that we were just fielding when you came in was about right at the end of the semester, and it's getting close to final exams. Do you have any experiences about what to do with that sort of like the last little bit of your course when you're preparing students for final exams? Do you leave time to cover that stuff before the final exam, or what's your end of course look like?
Oh, it's just the same really as the rest of the course, which is surprising. Most of the time I think it probably would have been different if I was not using standards-based grading. But because I'm using standards-based grading, there are about 10 quizzes throughout the semester, and I take the curriculum that everyone teaches at TCC and I break it up into 30 standards. And so they'll see 2 or 3 standards per quiz. And then they have the opportunity to reassess on up to 2 standards per week. So at the end of the semester, it's the same as it has been, but now all of a sudden the students are panicking. They realize that, you know, their grades, like this is their last opportunity to improve their grades. And so I'm doing a lot of grading in the last few weeks of class. So I just tell the students, even in the syllabus, I tell them, be prepared for the fact that you're not going to get the same feedback from me that you normally would. I try to leave a lot of detailed feedback. So that those last 2 weeks of class, I'm not going to have the turnaround time that I would typically have earlier in the semester. But it's the same as the first 14 weeks of this semester. It's just more volume as far as grading is concerned.
Great. I'll share with everyone something that I've been doing for the last several years about that end of semester push. I save a full day toward the end of the semester for what I call a reassessment carnival. And the way that this works is that I make up new versions of all of the possible standards. I have my students complete a Google form about what standards they want to tackle. Everyone's invited to complete as many as they can in that either 50-minute or 75-minute time period. So they just have to tell me ahead of time so I can make enough photocopies for everyone. So they all show up. They don't have to come that day. They can come and just do one quiz and then leave. If they come, they can only have one on their desk at a time. So they grab one from a folder, run and sit down and do that 1 or 2 question quiz. They come and hand it to me and I start grading, and then they can grab the next one. So it's a carnival because there's lots of movement, people running around, scurrying around the room. It's a bit of a craziness. And then I'm grading them as fast as I can. So I've been doing this for a while. It's really helped give the students a reason to sort of go back and study that earlier material and help them prepare for the final exam, because it's sort of like their last chance effort to get in that last couple of standards that they wanted to do. It's also been really good to sort of talk about, like, you know, what were the big picture ideas? What's the thing that you didn't know back in January that you can demonstrate now that you know? And the students are usually very grateful. It definitely is a little bit of work for me because, you know, I end up with a very big stack of them. So I'm grading them very, very quickly, as fast as I can. So that's sort of the challenge, but that's an idea. All right, back to our Q&A. Here's a really good question. Do you do anything differently to get buy-in and understanding of standards-based grading for students who may be in their first college course compared to what you might do in an upper division course? Might some students have trouble getting used to college and this new way of grading at the same time? Anyone of you want to tackle that?
I guess I can go first. I don't know. It's quiet. I think one of the things that I, usually talk to them about is, I mean, they all kind of expect college to be a little bit different in some way. They're not necessarily sure how it's going to be different. And so, I tell them, like, I know this is different. I kind of have a rubric that I show them, and I show them a problem that's completely worked out. And I also show them the points. And then I also show them a list of things that I would expect for mastery. And so that way I try to be as transparent as possible up front, and just basically explain, for every single concept, I have a list of things that I need to see in order to check off the mastery. And I also have them sort of read some things. In the past, I've had them come to my office hours or sign off or something saying that they've read about the mastery-based system. I've put up links to Carol Dweck's work on growth mindset, things like that, and the learning management system. And I've spent a lot of time talking to them about, depending on which class it is, whether, for all of the classes, it's useful, but you can kind of reframe it a little bit differently. In calculus, I talk some about the fact that it really does build, and for those people who are taking Calc 2, you really do need that solid foundation of Calc 1. If it's a course like our finite course, I'll talk to them some about basically, just sort of meeting them where they're at and just saying, it might sound harsh, but the idea is we're learning and we do want to learn, and I care that you learn by the end of the semester, not that you are learning, right now, right away. And I say, a lot of people sometimes have gotten tripped up in the past during, let's say, a test week because they spent too much time studying for a different class and not enough time in, what they felt like was the math class. But, say that's okay. Like, you can rebound in this class. We can work from there. That's one of the great things about this system is that, you know, you can catch up if you fell behind at some point. If there was something you missed, there's an opportunity to still learn, to still work through it. I'm always happy to go back through material with them, things like that.
Mhm.
That's great.
Love that.
We have another question here. So has Sasha or anyone found that standards-based grading in developmental math courses leads to better performance in calculus or future courses?
Like I actually don't use standards-based grading in those classes.
Well, that's a great thing. Why is that? Tell us.
I tried it one semester at TU. I was a graduate teaching assistant, and they said, in exchange for your tuition, just teach this one pre-calculus class because you have teaching experience. And I said, okay. And I said, I really want to try standards-based grading with the pre-calc students here. And that's a very different population than the population that we have at Tulsa Community College. Probably, I had 5 or 6 students in class that were student athletes that were missing 1 out of 3 classes a week. And if I'm giving quizzes every week, like they're missing a lot of quizzes. They didn't quite get it. I feel like for the first 2 months in that pre-calculus class at TU, they didn't understand the system. It was just this weird thing. And I don't do sort of satisfactory, unsatisfactory with master-based grading, with standards-based grading. I use a 0 to 4 scale, so they average their grades like they average a GPA. They say, you know, is it a 4? Is it a 3.5? Is it a 3? You know, and then they know what those numbers mean. But the first 2 months of teaching pre-calculus with standards-based grading, the students were not with me. And I don't know if it was just the difference in the population that just was something that they weren't accustomed to, or if I didn't sell it as well as I typically do with the calculus students. But they didn't really get it. And from talking to my colleagues at TCC, I got the impression that our pre-calculus students and the students who don't have the same motivation to retain the material as they go from class to class may not like doing all this extra work. They don't really care that much about learning it. They just want to get their grade and go. And I don't believe that that's true about all of our pre-calculus students. But the part of what works for me in the calculus sequence at TCC is I sort of sell it to them as, like, do you want to learn math? Like, do you want to know what you're doing? When you take your 3000 level engineering analysis class, do you want to be able to keep up with the lecture and not just feel like I remember that I've forgotten that material from a couple of years ago? Like, do you really, is that what you desire? If it is, I'll do everything that in my power to help you. I put this image on the board. It's a coffee cup, and it's got that quote from Game of Thrones, "We drink and we know things." But I was not referring to alcohol. I was referring to like coffee. But like that being our philosophy in this class is like we hang out, we talk, we do a lot of math, and we're here to learn, and we like it. And there's something about this like snowballing effect when you find out all you have to do is study, and guess what? Your grade is higher. You studied, you got a new grade, now your grade is higher. And then you study again and you get a new grade and your grade is higher. And that just keeps happening. And so once the students realize that their grade is completely within their control, they say, all you have to do is learn and you get the A. You want to turn your C into an A? That's great. It's going to be a lot of work and you might have like some ego hits here. I'm going to have to tell you, you've forgotten some things and you're going to feel stupid, and don't feel stupid, but you know, people feel that way. But after you go through the ego hits, guess what? You're going to know all this math, and it's going to feel really good, and everyone's going to want to study with you. And I just sort of sell it that way. And I tried to do something similar with the pre-calculus students, and I didn't have the same success. They're like, I don't care about knowing this. I'm a psychology major.
Great. All right, we've got another question here from our Q&A. It says, I'm not clear on what assessments should look like. How many questions, what type of problems, and so on. I was wondering if some of the quizzes, exams, et cetera, could be shared, for example, something from Cal 1 on any one standard. Joshua, we haven't heard from you. Do you want to field this question? What does an assessment look like? How do you choose good questions?
Sure. So the questions are going to often, for me, are going to often look like what you would ask to assess that particular skill anyway. I did, one of the things that I did early on is I would try to ask these complex questions that brought in a bunch of different standards, and then I would, in scoring, try to sort those out. And it's not that I wasn't able to do that, but it did sort of add to the time, and I have developed over time more of a one standard per page, or maybe two standards per page, but clearly marked which, for each problem, which standard it goes with. So I'll try to have, maybe a 5-page test for a 50-minute class, and then 1 or 2 standards per page. So that's going to end up being maybe about 8 standards or skills that I'm trying to assess on any particular test. One of the panelists earlier today talked about how everything is just a quiz, and one quiz is one standard, and then a test is a bundle of quizzes. So I just think, and when you're thinking about what the skills that you want to assess are, what kinds of questions you're going to do to assess that, you ask that question and you collect it. So it doesn't look so different from a traditional test.
Great. We had the question about the sizes from some of our courses. How large are your intro courses, and do you feel that you can give adequate individual feedback for large classes? For context, we also often have more than 100 students in intro lecture courses without TA support. And I'd like to convert to standards-based grading for my intro class, but I worry about the practical aspects. So do any of you have large classes or have any insight about how to make this practical?
I don't know if this is super helpful, but one of the things I have done in the past is just take a couple minutes the day that I hand back the test and address major issues that I've seen. So instead of maybe writing all of the individual feedback on every single test, just addressing the entire class and just basically trying to address whatever the underlying misconception might be and explaining it in terms of the test. And that way I can just address the entire class at once. And, even if somebody didn't miss it, it's still helpful maybe to draw the distinction of, I think we can pinpoint what the misconception was and just make sure we can clear that up. And so there are times that instead of writing a lot of individual feedback, I'll group and maybe pull out the top 5 or 6 errors that I think need to be addressed for the whole class and then not write as much on those. And I think I saw some people earlier in the session I was in discussing using certain parts of Canvas to automatically grade some of the questions too for larger classes, and using some of those online features where they could sort of copy and paste comments. Someone earlier said, they had a spreadsheet of the common mistakes they saw. And somebody even suggested, I think in my breakout session earlier, that they would basically make a list of things and they could just highlight things that needed to be addressed. So they kind of had a rubric for a problem or give numbered feedback like, oh, items 1, 7, and 10, somehow something was wrong with those pieces of my rubric on your work, which made it faster at least.
Great, thanks. Okay, another question from our Q&A. Any thoughts on addressing the temptation on the student's part to procrastinate? It's easy for them to wait and say, I'll just get to it later, but that sets them up for too much of a hurdle when it all happens at once later. Anyone have any ideas?
I think limiting my students to 2 standards per week helps with that. They know 8 weeks out, when we're 8 weeks from the end of the semester, you have 16 more opportunities to reassess. And then they feel that as it gets less and less and less. But I emphasize at the very beginning of the semester, I'm like, look, you've got 32 opportunities. Like this is, there are 30 standards in the course. Like theoretically, you could reassess on everything. You could do everything twice if you want to. Or there can be that one standard that you're really struggling with and you could do that 3 times and that's totally fine too. But I think limiting it to a certain number per week, that helps with the volume on grading for me as well. There is always a little bit of procrastination. But I think another thing that helps with the procrastination is I always have my students from the previous semester give advice to students for next semester. And they always tell the class after them, don't procrastinate, don't wait till the last minute. This is not, this system is not set up so that you can slack off and not learn. Like, the system is set up so that you can learn. And so when the students hear that from their peers rather than hearing it from me, I think they take it more seriously. So that's helped.
Great. Mandy or Joshua, do you guys have any thoughts about how to prevent student procrastination?
I've done something similar to Sasha, which is to limit to 2 standards per week, and so they're forced to think ahead, and that has mitigated a lot of problems. But then also, just to jump in with something that Kate mentioned earlier, having that I think that does need to be complemented with some final opportunities, some big carnival type opportunities. And I think that a theme I've been hearing throughout today in several conversations is just more assessment opportunities, that along with this, just lots of smaller types of assessments are a helpful part of the process.
Yeah, I will say originally when I first started, I let anybody take any concept they hadn't previously mastered before in a week, which could add up to, people doing 10 in a week or something, which is a lot. And then I noticed people were procrastinating because I think they had too many options. So what I started to do, a couple semesters, I actually implemented a penalty. And I said that you needed to show that you were studying and trying in between testing periods. And so you had to at least attempt, study for it and give a valid attempt toward retaking any concept you hadn't previously mastered. Otherwise there'd be a penalty. So I had tried that. And then I eventually just also decided to cut back on the number of retake opportunities. And that also, I think, basically had the same effect. And then I would just be very clear about trying to remind students about the retakes and about how many opportunities they had left and when those opportunities were, things like that. And that generally worked too.
I like the idea of the carnival at the end of the semester. I think that that's a beautiful idea. The only downside is that I can't give the same feedback. But if I told them in advance, if I told them on week 1, you have 2 a week, and with those 2 a week, I'm going to give you detailed feedback. This is the type of mistake you're making. These are the things you need to review and all of that. I said, but there's going to be a carnival at the end where I'm just going to look at it and I'm going to say 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'm going to give you a grade. And that would give a lot of people an opportunity to boost their grades and an opportunity or a motivation to study. I can see how that would be really helpful. I think I'm going to take that, Kate.
From a technical perspective, I'll tell you that I do this every semester, and I've blogged about it. You can see photos of it on my blog, so I'm not trying to keep it secret. But I don't tell my students about the Reassessment Carnival until after the W deadline for them to withdraw from the course, because there are some students, for whatever reason, who may not actually make it to the end, and I don't want them thinking like, okay, I'll wait until that last day. I'll show up in that 50 minutes. I'll handle 26 quizzes and boom, I'll be done, right? And so I tend to sort of say, like, there's this limit of 1 per week. I really am not really sure if you're going to be able to make it unless you really bump up the effort that you're putting in to sort of, keep them doing that. And then sometime, after that W deadline's happened, and I know that most of my students are working really hard, then I tell them, like, look, don't worry, I'm going to let you do this. It'll be the last day of class. Like, I really want you to show me evidence of your learning. So don't give up on that task of, growing and learning as you go. It's just, I worry about telling them this too early. So your mileage may vary. Anyhow, back to the Q&As. Here's a really great question. And I think that this is something that we should all be mindful of. What are some downsides that you've noticed using mastery grading in your lower level courses? How have you mitigated these downsides, or just your mastery grading in general? What are the downsides you've seen? Joshua, you want to start us off?
I'd like a minute to think, actually.
All right. Mandy?
Because the first answer I would give would be precisely the question of getting overwhelmed, and how you set boundaries for yourself on that. I think that's already been talked about a fair amount.
Mandy, do you have anything to add about downsides? You want a minute, which is fine.
No, yeah, I would say, I mean, downsides, yeah, for the instructor, obviously, is lots and lots of work. And I've had, sometimes students who are a little more anxious really want that instant feedback. I've had students come and they'll just, it's a day that I have a lot of people doing retakes, and somebody will be like, can you just grade mine right now? And I was like, I think, like, we can take a deep breath, we can talk about it, but, I can't talk to you about it if there's somebody else in my office taking that same concept, right? Sometimes, if they're, depending on the student, right, you can step out in the hall, talk to them, things like that. But there were times that I definitely was slammed and had, people in my office taking it, people in the hallway taking it, people in corrals by the dean's office taking it, and there's just a lot of grading, sometimes at the end of the semester too. But I think too, it's one of those things, if you are selling it, and again, word of mouth with students, eventually I think some of those problems subside a little bit. There are always some students that may take the retakes for granted, but I do think that at least, like, if you limit yourself, your pace, how long it takes to grade, things like that. I think that gets a little bit easier. I would say sometimes I've had a couple students who kind of they've just decided a grade that they would want, and then they decide they'll never master like particular concepts. They leave them blank routinely, and they just decided it was too hard for them, and they could still get whatever grade they wanted with, like, basically not learning certain pieces of information, which, I mean, if they want a certain grade, they want a certain grade. But, the teacher part of me really does want them to at least attempt and try everything.
That's great. Anyone want to add anything else before we move on?
I would say one other thing, which I would certainly not have expected. A lot of us have had the experience that many of our students feel much less anxious with this method, but that is not universally true. There are some students who are perfectionists, and if they get their test back or whatever, and they only got, say, 7 out of 10 standards, and so they're like, wait, do I have a C now? And trying to, and I guess the way I've addressed that is just by being very clear every time. You're doing your best for today, and if you don't get it this time, that is completely okay. It is entirely okay not to get the credit this time, because you'll show me later.
Yeah, I definitely completely agree with that. I think that some students have gotten really good at the game that school is. They've gotten, they've figured out how to play the game really well, on how to, like, get partial credit and ask for more points and all of this kind of stuff. And then when they're encountered with this kind of new system, their old procedures, their old skill set doesn't really work at getting them, that A that they know that they've always had, and they tend to sort of struggle with the ideas about mastery grading, that, you can't really squeak by and use the same strategies that you've had before. And I also think that mastery grading it can be a lot of emotional labor, because we're giving students a lot of feedback and then asking them to really go back and look at their mistakes and learn from those mistakes. And I think that we should be cognizant of students and their backgrounds and their availability to take on that emotional labor as a thing that's really weighty, apart from the mathematical labor that we're already asking them to do, right? So we just need to acknowledge that. All right, back to the Q&A.
May I add something?
Yeah, sure.
It's very similar to what you guys said, just jumping on what you just said. I've had the one downside that I've seen, and it's just in a very small minority of students, is that some people take this class, I think because I've done such a good job selling it, thinking that it's easy, and it's going to be easy, and they're going to get an A, and it's okay if they don't know it. They can procrastinate and they can learn it later. And, if they don't know integration by parts, it's no big deal. They can just take the integration by parts standard later. And that attitude of it's, yeah, I'll be fine, it's going to be easy, and then it turns out to not be easy. Like, it turns out, like, you actually really have to know what you're doing to get a 4. Like, a 4 is perfect. A 3.5 is like a small, like a sign error or a small arithmetic error or something like that. A 3 is like, you did a good job, but not quite, you haven't explained yourself well enough to make it an A. Like, this is good work. It's just not, it's not excellent work yet. And the students that are used to getting like 98, 99 for doing that, and now are getting a 3.5, they're like 3.5. So, but I guess my point is the it's going to be easy thing. I have a very small minority of students that will come into my class thinking that with standards-based grading, I'm just going to give them the same problems over and over again, and it's going to be fine. If you don't know how to do trig substitution, you're just going to get a new trig substitution problem, no big deal. I'm like, but you actually have to learn trig substitution before you take that quiz. Otherwise, you're going to fail. Your grade's going to go down. Like, it's going to get much, much worse. And so there are students that are like used to gaming the system that now they can't game it, and they do really have to learn. And they walked in with an expectation of like, oh, this is going to be easy. I can slack off and then I can just memorize how to do some problems. Like, that doesn't work in my class. You don't get good grades in my class doing that. And I think the students come in with that attitude because I do say things like, you can turn your C into an A, no big deal. You want to learn, you can learn. And, you know, anytime you want to improve your grade, you can. And I think that that's absolutely true, but sometimes they don't realize the amount of work involved. And like you were talking about, that emotional labor, the ego hits involved in learning from feedback.
Great, that actually segues perfectly into our next question from the Q&A. So, if students are supposed to learn from their mistakes, how much feedback and what kind of feedback are you able to provide when they don't meet the standard fully?
So this is where two things happen, I think. One is in trying to be as clear at the start, or whenever it is that you provide the standards or specifications to students, what exactly it is you want them to do. And for them to be able to see, yeah, I'm not doing this yet, you know, I'm not finding this limit yet, or something like that. And so that being clear about your expectations up front, and then also that's, you know, if you're able to have office hours, that is a great jumping off point for an office hours conversation. And if you're, so for instance, something I've adopted from other people's ideas is that in order, before doing a reassessment, they have to complete a ticket where they say what they did wrong on their previous assessment, and then what they've done to improve since then. And one of the options is coming and talking to me. So I think those two things, what I would say.
Something that I've done recently too about offering feedback is I've, when I'm writing feedback on a quiz or something like that, I've tried to change my feedback into questions. So instead of saying, you know, this is not the right theorem that you should have applied here, I've said, you know, what other theorem might apply here, or something like this. And I found that that process of writing questions down tends to generate a lot more dialogue. Like it's an invitation to come talk with me about this feedback, rather than like a boom, like this is what I have to tell you, that's the end of the story. And students will often come up to me after class and say, you know, what did you mean by this question? And sometimes we're able to sort out what the component was that was missing there through that dialogue that we have, instead of me just, you know, as the authority telling them, this is what you did wrong, go fix it. Instead of when I say, you know, what happened here? What did you do wrong? What's another path forward through this? Okay, here's another great question from the Q&A. Any idea for how assessments and reassessments might work in an online setting? And/or what did you do or change this past semester when you went online? What happened to your reassessment process?
I can take this one. I was teaching Calculus 3. I had 2 sections of Calculus 3 and 1 of Calculus 1. And they were all expecting standards-based grading, and everyone at work thought I was going to have to abandon standards-based grading. They're like, there's no way she can pull this off. And I was like, I think I can do it. So for both courses, I wrote 20 quizzes, 20 online quizzes with pooled questions, but now they're not getting the same feedback that they were getting before. They were taking them either in my math lab or WebAssign, depending on which textbook they were in. We had one calculus book for Calc 1, and the Calc 3 students are using the old calculus book, the one that we're phasing out. But they now had 4 opportunities to reassess on every quiz. They could ask me for help whenever they missed a problem. So I had virtual office hours, and, sometimes people would come, sometimes I would, log on for 5 minutes and I realized that nobody was coming. But I was there, and I, offered to help them solve some problems, and then they would retake the quiz. And the quizzes tended to have between 5 and 10 problems on them, so that I could actually give 0 through 4 grades eventually. So I was taking percentages and then converting them back to the SBG scale that I was using earlier in the semester. The students didn't like that as much because they weren't getting the same feedback, and the quizzes weren't written by me. So it wasn't exactly the format that they were accustomed to. Like, they were accustomed to seeing, like, okay, when Miss Townsend asks you about this standard, here are 5 or 6 things that she tends to ask. And we've got variations on a theme. And as long as I'm prepared for those problems and I understand all the related concepts, then I'll be ready for that quiz. Well, WebAssign and my math lab didn't have my quiz questions, so I was kind of stuck with whatever they had. I think it went really well for some people, but there were a few students that went from being A students or B students in the face-to-face SBG to like failing everything when we went online. And then I had some students that went online and just knocked everything out of the park. Suddenly, if I had 20 standards that they could retake online and 4 opportunities to reassess per standard, I said, now it's open book. I mean, I've got all these extra benefits for you, but you're not getting feedback. And I'm sorry. I just can't give you feedback on 80 online quizzes. Like, it's just not possible. But you can take them as many times as you want until May, whatever. And it worked really well for most people, but there were just a couple of students that I feel like it didn't work well because they weren't getting the same feedback. And I don't think that they were as motivated to improve in the online environment. I think they saw those bad grades, and then they just felt they felt bad about it, and then they didn't reach out.
Great. Mandy, do you have any experiences moving any of your reassessments and your testing online after this big transition?
Yeah, I basically would post a PDF that was timed to be released on the learning management system on specific retake days. So I would tell people that a specific day was a retake day, and they had between this hour and this hour. And since I was trying to keep it basically low-key for tech, just since we switched last minute onto online, but I did request that they use something like Adobe Scan, which is a free app, to show me all of their work. You can basically just use your phone, take a picture of it. It combines all of it into one PDF. Some of the testing periods, my classes were small enough that I could proctor over Zoom. Some of the classes where I had international students and that wasn't feasible, I just kind of had to let go of some of the proctoring, right? And just also post the test on the learning management system. It was open for a certain window, post some reminders in the announcements, things like that. Still had office hours over Zoom and over email. But then also, just kind of would post them to the learning management system, post the full list of all my concepts so you could take the ones that you needed in there.
Great. Here's one that I just answered in the chat, but I'm interested to see what you guys say. I got a couple of the same kind of questions. Are the standards or objectives explicitly listed on the assessment problems? Do you always tell your students this problem is related to this standard? And if not, how does that work? Joshua, you want to start us?
Yeah, so I think this relates back to when I said I tried to write these complex problems with lots of different standards come in, and then I've moved more towards a 1 standard per page. I don't think that there's any downside to doing that, to keying problems to standards. And if one of the things you want them to do, I noticed in the Q&A, you know, what if you want them to be able to solve an integral with a particular type of method, but you also want them to be able to figure out which method to use. You can make that a separate standard, and you know, say, you know, one of the things you have to do is maybe not solve all these integrals, but identify what a useful technique would be for each one. So I have moved very much towards the keying one problem to a standard. That's good for the students, but it's also easier for me.
Great. So just a heads up that we have about 5 minutes left here. We don't have a break after our panel, so I'm going to ask a final question. If we didn't get your questions today, there are a whole bunch of great questions in the Q&A. I totally invite you to come and join us on our Slack community. I also think there are tons of good answers to many of these questions beyond just those of us who are here. So please come and ask your questions if we didn't quite get to them. So many of them are really good. All right, here's our last question. How do you discuss status of students' final grade during the semester? Do you discuss with them what they haven't mastered yet, or what do you tell them? Anyone? I know that some people have meetings, one-on-one meetings with their students where they sort of go over toward the end, you know, these are the last things that you need to line up and do before the final exam. Do any of you have that kind of information? How do you talk with your students about this?
It's all in the grade book. It's just this huge grid of grades. And when the students look at it and they want to improve their grade, you can usually go and find the low grades. You're like, okay, well, what do you need to work on? Well, we'll find, you know, this group of 3 standards, or like, these are the ones that are holding you back. It's preventing you from getting the grade you want. And the students will usually come to me and they'll ask about it. And then we'll talk about like next course in sequence. What do you need to know from here? And we say, okay, there are 4 standards that you could bring up, but these 2 are going to help you in Calc 2, or these 2 are going to be really important in differential equations. So let's make sure that you know how to do this. And those are also important, but not as important as these. So let's focus on this. And then, you know, then the student retakes those standards.
Awesome. All right, we just have a couple minutes left. I was going to give each of you maybe 30 seconds to sort of summarize anything else that you want to get off your chest. You want to summarize your grading philosophy. You want to solve all of these big questions for us. Mandy, go for it.
Well, just to sort of piggyback off of the last comment, was just one of the things I do too that I think is a little bit helpful is in Calculus 1, I provide a concept map. So where they would see concepts again, and I think it helps them understand that there's an order to some of them, like knowing implicit differentiation before you do related rates, just to help draw connections for them and help map out how all of the content fits together. And then it kind of helps them give an order of where they should start studying and tackling retakes too.
Great. Joshua?
I would say take advantage of using standards or whatever other method you use for assessment to measure how well you're structuring the course to be what you want it to be. And if there are things that you want to emphasize in the grading, find ways to do that. Some people have, you know, duplicate reassessments, or there are things that that figure into the final grade different ways. And so you can emphasize those for your students, but you can also check yourself and say, am I really doing in this class what I want to do?
Great. Sasha, you want to give us a 30-second summary?
I'm just going to piggyback on what Josh said. When you look at that grade book, I've got a row for every student and a column for every standard. And that column tells me how well I'm doing. So if I'm looking at Calculus 1 and I see that all of my students are struggling with related rates, now I know that I've got to redo something there. So I would say focus on the rows so that you can help students improve their grades, and you can focus on each individual students and their understanding, but then also look at the columns to see what's going really well in your class and where you can improve as well.
Great. Well, I just want to take a moment to say thank you to all of our panelists. I get so many good ideas from hearing each of you speak. I wish that we could do this more often so I could just soak them all in. Thanks to everyone who's coming. We will see you over at our final Zoom link for our conference farewell. You have 15 seconds to get there, so get going.
Thank you.
Thank you.